much as we're savoring those things, we gotta wait till 5 o'clock, okay? So in the meantime, we're gonna be hearing some great speakers, and I just wanna let you know that after we finish their presentation, we got one more speaker en route, so he should be here shortly, but he's our last speaker, so it should work okay. After their presentations, we will have ample time to have some good discussions and questions. So I just want to make you aware of that. Just a matter of introduction, I'm Jorge Fernandez, and I work Vice President for Global Commerce. So very suitable for what we're going to be hearing at the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. And on my day in and day out, what we do is basically tell the Atlanta story to keep markets around the world for the purpose of recruiting foreign companies to come here, and then also helping Atlanta-based companies find opportunities and grow on the international marketplace. So that's a little bit about myself. The Chamber itself is a private business organization. We've been around for 155 years. So we're one of the oldest business organizations in the United States from a chamber perspective, 100% private. We're not government, and we do not get funding from any government sources. So why don't we just quickly introduce yourself and your name and your key area of responsibilities, and then as we introduce you back on, I'll tell a little bit about what you're going to be talking. So why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you very much. I'm Tim McCain. I work for UPS. I am responsible for our U.S.-based international sales team.
Mike Thompson. I am an international tax partner with Deloitte Tax. I am based here in Atlanta. I serve multinational companies from a tax perspective, working with U.S.-based multinationals doing business outside the U.S. or non-U.S.-based multinationals doing business in the U.S. So that's kind of my client base.
Great. That's the purpose of global commerce, it's a two-way street, right?
Absolutely.
Good afternoon, I'm Ye Chu from Shanghai International Studies University. I'm a faculty member there, and now I'm doing my visiting scholarship at Pennsylvania State University. Thank you.
And what's your specialty?
My specialty is language and communication, and today I will talk about that later.
Great. And Mr. Jim?
I have a dual role. I'm a chairman of Embassy National Bank in Atlanta. And also I own a hotel company with our back office functions in Mumbai, India. We have a lot of real estate investment in India. So I respect a little bit about India.
Perfect. Great market and great providers of global commerce. It's very interesting because like I mentioned before, on my day in and day out, I deal with the issues that this gentleman represents. And when it comes to foreign direct investment, one of quite interesting watershed event has happened that starting in 2014, the United States replaced China as the #1 recipient of foreign direct investment stock, which is kind of very interesting because what that meant was that up to 2014, China held the #1 position in terms of receiving foreign investment. And in 2014, those roles reversed. What that means is to give you an idea of the importance of the U.S. market, what it represents, and all the different attributes of what that market means to foreign investors coming into the United States or trying to invest in foreign markets. Of course, like I mentioned, global commerce is a two-way street. One of the aspects of the jobs that we do at the Chamber, particularly from the global commerce perspective, is, like I mentioned before, is telling the Atlanta story to potential foreign investors, so then we can help them, introduce them to Atlanta, and to come and then invest here in the region. We got great results from that. Anybody had any idea of how many Georgians are employed by foreign companies? Any guesses?
40%.
That's a little bit high. That's a little bit high. But it's about 140,000 Georgian that are employed by foreign entities, which makes her around the seventh in the United States, just to put it in perspective. The issue is that jobs provided by foreign companies, it's very big. The top 10 countries that invest in the Metro Atlanta region, 7 are European. The non-Europeans are Japan, Mexico, and Canada. The other one, the number 1 and 2 slot, it's kind of disputed between the United Kingdom and Japan. One in terms of the number of companies, and the other one in terms of employment. In terms of the number 1 and number 2 foreign investors in the Atlanta region. And when I say Atlanta region, I'm talking about the metropolitan area. So, but nevertheless, it's important for the community and the economic impact that has, not only in terms of direct in terms of the direct investment dollars, the capital investment, but more important in terms of jobs, both direct and indirect. On average, any companies that deals on international, their average pay, it's about 7 to 10% more than just a domestic company. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is the reverse, which is the export side or the outbound in investment, and that's about local companies growing in foreign markets. For the Atlanta region, the story is we have an export intensity, which is the percentage of the export of the part of the GMP. GMP is the gross metropolitan product, or the GDP of the region. By the way, does anybody know what is the GDP of the Metro Atlanta area? Any ideas? It's $207 billion. So if Atlanta, just to put it in perspective, if Atlanta would be an independent country, the Metro Atlanta area, we are the 33rd economy of the world. So there's only 32 countries that are bigger than the GDP of this region. So this is a very powerful region in the United States, in one of the fastest growing southeast region of the United States, and the capital, the economic capital of that, is where you're standing right now. So the economic impact of the foreign parts of that, it's huge. So this translates into opportunities. When it comes to exports, we are an under-exporter nation. We are an under-exporter city. Only about 5% of existing companies exports in the United States. Only 5%, and we are not any different than that. In fact, like I said, the component of the exports, the impact of the exports over the GDP of this region, it's about 9.5. The average of the United States is about 10.3. So the important piece of here is that what we're going to be talking about has a direct impact on opportunities for business. Because 95% of the consumers are outside the United States. In particular, if you look at the growing middle class, what is happening in India, what is happening in China, so the opportunities are huge. And then 95% of those companies that do not do exports, imagine what the opportunities implies into that. So how do you then approach this global commerce activities? Is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking from the specific market opportunities. So we're going to be talking a little bit about India, correct? We're also going to be talking about the tax implications, about how to do business cross-border. We're going to be talking about the legal piece of that and the supply chain, and where some of the growth opportunities are, particularly in emerging nations. And then, at the end of the day, we are humans, right? And global commerce is done through human contact. And one of the most important parts of that is communications. So how do we communicate? How do we effectively communicate to be productive in this global commerce activity is going to be the topic that Dr. Schumann will be talking about. So any questions? Does that sort of give you an expectations of what we're going to be talking about? So we're going to start with our first speaker, and our first speaker is Mike Thompson. And like he said, he's coming in from Deloitte. And he will cover the tax implication of global commerce, both from the commercial side, but also from the supply chain, because of supply chain is integral to this, to what global commerce is all about. It's all about. So these are what are some of the tax implications that that legal entity faces while doing activities cross borders. But also about what does that mean? What you need to know about, but also what are some of those opportunities that you can find on the tax implication. So with that, let me turn it over to him.
Okay.
And we have some slides for you, right?
They magically
Up
advance.
here.
This is great.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's ironic that we're starting with tax, because I think what you'll take away from my
Well, it's
comments
April.
is
Apropos.
2 days earlier. Well, I think what you'll hear and take away from my comments is tax is it's inevitable. It is a result of global commerce. It should never drive how you do business, and business is run as the business needs to run, but it's a result. What I'll talk about is where the opportunity lies is to not let tax just be a result, but to bring that up into and have it part of developing your operational strategy. And that's particularly important when you think about doing business globally. So we can maybe go to the first slide. So when I think about global commerce, and when I was asked to be on this panel, I started thinking about what does that mean from a tax perspective. And I think in my mind, thinking about how businesses work and the elements of the supply chain, most businesses have one or more of these elements in what they do, starting with the development of a product, design engineering. What are we going to sell? How do we improve it? There's procurement. Where are we going to get the raw materials that go into our products? There's manufacturing. How do we make it? How do we manage our inventory? How do we get it to where it needs to be in terms of our distribution? How do we market and sell our product? What is our strategy around that? And then there's post-sale services, whether that be financing, insurance, maybe it's post-sale consulting opportunities. All of these are elements of how companies do business, whether it be in a single country or whether it be across the globe. And as you can imagine, managing these aspects of a business in a single country is challenging enough. But when you start stretching that across the globe, where you've got many different jurisdictions and cultures and tax regimes, it can become more and more complicated. And what we are seeing as a trend as the global economy and companies begin to operate globally is it's stretching the traditional supply chain, which has been more jurisdictional and entity focused, to being more globally focused. And what that is driving, and none of this is tax, what it's really driving is some inefficiencies in how fixed assets are used. One jurisdiction may have excess capacity in its plant. Another jurisdiction or operating unit might be turning away sales because they don't have the capacity to manufacture that product anymore, and they're not talking to each other. So what we are seeing is as a result of globalization of business is a rethinking how the supply chain should work and work more efficiently on a global basis. So let's go to the next slide. So this kind of just illustrates the point a little more. Again, the traditional supply chain was more organized around a jurisdiction or a business unit, and the elements of the supply chain were looked at within that business unit or within that jurisdiction. What we are really seeing today is, as a result of global commerce, is it's really forcing a transformation in the way that companies think about the supply chain. If you look to the right, the this is what we are seeing as the trend, and that is to think about the elements of the supply chain across the organization and across the globe, not just by country or business unit. And that's really forcing a change in where strategic decision makers within the organization may be located. Where are assets located around the globe that help facilitate this? Where are the risks associated with this? With the economic risk of product development. If we're going to think about product development on a global basis, who's bearing the economic risk of loss of that? When you're doing business cross-border, there's currency risk. There's inventory obsolescence risk. Where in the organization is that born when you're working across business units and across legal entities? So that's becoming an issue that comes up when companies are looking at transforming their supply chains. And so the last bullet point here, I think, is the most important takeaway today. If you're not a tax person, I think this really maybe brings it home and why this is important. And it's important because taxes are assessed on an entity-by-entity basis and a jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction basis. So which legal entity in your legal entity organizational chart is engaging in that activity or is engaging in that transaction, and what jurisdiction that income is considered to be earned in or that transaction occurs in is highly relevant from a tax perspective. So when from a tax perspective, when we think about, and I think about the supply chain, I think about all the boxes that are sitting on your legal entity org chart and who's doing what and how they interact with each other, because that drives how much tax you pay at the end of the day within your business. So let's go to the next slide. So the opportunity that's created out of this from a tax perspective is really proactively thinking about how do I integrate my tax strategy with my operational strategy. Businesses essentially consist of assets, functions, and risk that generate a return for their owner. There's also capital that's deployed to help generate that return. And if in developing or transforming the supply chain, where pieces are going to come from, who's going to do what, as we move and companies move to more of a centralized model and standardized model across the globe, thinking about where those assets are at, where those people are at performing those strategic functions, where are risks going to be born, what legal entity is going to bear those risks, and integrating that into the transformation can drive tax savings for the global organization. And there's also the capitalization of how is expansion funded? Where does the capital come from? Which legal entity is going to borrow the funds to finance expansion? How is that capitalization spread among all of the legal entities, and is it optimized among the legal entities within your organizational structure? So again, the opportunity here is to align the relevant assets, functions, and risk in an optimal way from a tax perspective that's integrated with the operational strategy of the business. And that's where you can get a tax optimized supply chain structure. And I think that's, sometimes there's many different terms for this. Within Deloitte, we refer to this as business model optimization. It's really taking a fresh look at transforming the supply chain, but also integrating tax into that process. So let's go to the next slide. This is just kind of another illustration of what I'm talking about, kind of the evolution of a traditional structure to more of a global structure. But there are elements of profit, as we talked about. There can be risk-based profit. There can be profit from strategic functions. There can be profits from in-country operations like manufacturing, sales and distribution, key support functions. All of those make up an element of what each legal entity earns and is taxed on. When you're thinking about reorganizing or transforming the supply chain and centralizing certain functions or activities or risk associated activities, those can oftentimes be carved out from a particular legal entity and relocated in another legal entity that may be in a different jurisdiction that may have a more favorable tax regime. So things like who bears the economic risk associated with product development and then ultimately owns the intellectual property that's developed. Who bears risk of loss on inventory obsolescence, foreign exchange exposure, as I said. Who are the strategic decision makers around things like procurement? Who makes decisions on which plant is going to manufacture what product and where am I going to access excess capacity to deploy where I have excess demand? And then there's return on capital. How is Treasury and how is capital deployed in a strategic way? And those are elements that can be carved out of a legal entity and redeployed somewhere. They're important elements of the overall supply chain, but they can also be carved out and integrated into a separate legal entity and jurisdiction, which, as we've talked about, that's very important from a tax perspective and driving tax savings. So go to the next slide, just a quick illustration here, and then there's a lot of moving parts on here, but kind of post-transformation, what something like this might look like is you have a global or a regional headquarters where these strategic functions are at, these strategic or risk are born, and maybe your capital, this is where your capital is centrally located. This entity could be responsible for procurement or managing procurement from suppliers. Now that activity or directing people locally on the ground that are taking direction under a global policy around procurement to deliver the materials to one of the manufacturing facilities that may sit in a separate legal entity. As we said, we're not talking about moving factories, and you have to have people on the ground to do sales, but other elements of the business are more easily relocated, and if a company is looking at centralizing that, thinking about tax when you do that is important. So, there's a lot of different elements here, and I won't go through them all in the interest of time, but you can carve out the different elements of how a business runs and thinking about, again, jurisdictionally and legal entity-wise, where is that located to manage and optimize your taxes associated with doing business globally. So if we go to the next slide, did we miss one? Oh, let's go one more. I think maybe they're, okay, yeah, let's talk about this one for a second. So there are a number of tax considerations associated with doing business globally, and these are all the things that have to be considered and integrated into a global supply chain. I'll start at the top just to run through them. The taxable presence risk. Again, if you've got individuals, you've got salespeople that are going into a jurisdiction where you are not currently paying tax, if they are engaging in sales activity on a routine, regular basis, negotiating, concluding contracts, in most jurisdictions, that's going to rise to the level of a taxable presence. So understanding and having policies and protocols around what people can do and when they can do it from a sales standpoint helps manage tax risk. But also planning proactively around that. If you don't plan around that, it does create a risk because you can have a potential liability there that you're not aware of. So it's understanding where these things can occur within the organization. There's intercompany pricing, which is critical in a global organization. Some people refer to it as transfer pricing. There's enormous pressure on how pricing is done between related parties in a global organization. The OECD has undertaken an initiative, many of you probably have heard of it, around base erosion and profit shifting, or BEPS for short, is what it's referred to. But it is aimed at understanding how related parties and affiliates potentially shift profits between jurisdictions, and whether they're doing that appropriately or not. And that's why it's so important to integrate your tax plan into your operational plan. If you start doing things artificially around shifting profits and pricing without the real business activity and the substance and support to back it up, that is exactly what this base erosion and profit shifting initiative is aimed at. So actually integrating it into your operational plan and supply chain is one of the ways to make sure you don't run afoul of many of these potential legislative changes. So there's a number of other things listed there. In the interest of time, I'm gonna just summarize. I think that the takeaway here is that global commerce is driving transformation of the traditional supply chain and business model for multinational companies. If you take the time to consider the legal entity and jurisdictional location of assets, functions, which includes people, and the risk, that can drive tax savings. And the real value comes when you can integrate this planning around strategic location of assets and functions and risk into the business transformation, because you can create a tax optimized structure that is consistent with the business and will have minimized your tax risk across the globe.
Our next speaker is, I think, is a very great segue, since we're talking about supply chain. That we talk about UPS. So UPS, Tim is going to talk to us a little bit about growth opportunities, how consumers differ, and how about what can we do about companies that are already exporting or those that are new to exports, and how do you start that process of growth? So all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I am glad to be here to be able to discuss my primary focus, which is growing global commerce, more specifically the business that's generated from the power of global trade. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Shoup, Mr. Sahab are talking about many of the financial and cultural aspects of doing business in global commerce. But what that specifically means to a company like mine and to businesses that you're in as well, or the businesses you will be in, is its opportunity for you. What I wanted to do today, really, though, is to start from a little bit different perspective, and that's one that's been shaped over the last 108 years. It goes back to very humble beginnings at UPS when we started out as a messenger service with boys delivering messages in Seattle, Washington on bicycles. It was a very humble beginning for us. We now have over 400,000 employees doing business in over 200 countries worldwide. Now, if you fast forward through that over many reinventions of the company, reorganizations of how we were structured, you bring forward to where we are today, and really the 40-year journey that has taken us into international commerce. And again, continuing to fine-tune and rehome that business model that we utilize to make sure that we're delivering your packages around the globe as you need them to be done. This morning, nearly 100,000 drivers and pilots of one of the world's largest airlines were actually in different phases of delivering over 18 million packages that they do every single day. That's not to mention what we do in ocean freight, air freight, or our contract logistics businesses as well. Now, the only reason I bring this up or bring up this as a point, is that UPS has really become a bellwether, if you will, for what's happening in different markets and global economy. These days, UPS's volume is one of the most accurate reads of what's happening in global economies. So what does that read tell us today? Can we go on to the next slide? Okay. What we really see as we look around the globe right now are unprecedented disruptions. The concept of, I think we jumped ahead a few slides here. There we go. Thank you. The concept of business as usual has really been blown away. It's in pieces, it's in shambles. What I'd really like to talk about today, though, are how two of these disruptions are going to create opportunity, or do create opportunity for us in business today. The first element is the explosive growth that we're seeing from emerging markets and developing economies. Each day the world gives birth to another 200,000 people. By 2050, our children will share the planet with 9 billion other people, most of whom will live in urban areas. According to McKinsey, in the next 10 years, 136 new cities will replace older ones in the world's top 600 cities, all of them in the developing world, and 100 of them in China. I have two pictures, if you go to the next slide, that I think really illustrate the type of growth that is happening right now. On the left is a picture of Shenzhen in 1980. It's a city in South China. Shenzhen's population at that time was about 250,000 people. And as you can tell, it was quite agrarian at the time. The shot on the right is taken from the same angle in 2012. So Shenzhen today is a city of over 15 million people. So quite a bit of change over the last 30 years. So you really don't have to wait for that disruption to occur. It's already happened. 95% of the world's consumers are actually living outside of the United States. A large number of those people are in the middle class. Between 1990 and 2010, the period when communism fell and markets started to open, the percentage of people living in extreme poverty in developing countries dropped by half to 21%. Go on to the next slide. The middle class is booming in the so-called global south, which includes Africa, Central and Latin America, and most of Asia. It's predicted that Asia's middle class will jump from 525 million to 3.2 billion in the next 20 years. These are not just new consumers, they're empowered consumers. And this is the second disruption that I want to highlight today, is the empowered consumer. They see what our middle class populations have. They see how we live, and they want it. Technology gives them access to an unprecedented range of goods and services from every corner of the globe. Like their counterparts in developed economies, they have the means to take control of the research, shopping, and the buying process. As they do, they join consumers the world over in transforming retail. The report from Deloitte Digital says global e-commerce sales are expected to reach 1.4 trillion next year. The big spike, however, is in online cross-border commerce. Global GDP is expected to grow 3 to 4% through the rest of this decade. In the same time period, it's no surprise that retail growth is expected to outpace the GDP. For domestic e-commerce, predictions are from 10 to 12% growth, 4 times that of GDP. With cross-border e-commerce, global B2C, as we use the term we use at UPS, is expected to grow by 25%, or 7 times the rate of GDP. So that's a quick look at the major trends, emerging markets and empowered consumers, that are reshaping the business landscape today. Together they represent a wealth of opportunity as business person in the world is now your customer. But maybe you're the owner of a small to mid-sized company and you're concerned about how do you engage in international transactions. Or maybe you're with a larger company and you're looking to see the next export as your best option to grow or to maintain your continued growth. So what do you do to take advantage of it? Here's the simple answer really is just get in the game. Start. doing business internationally. I realize that it's easier said than done. Seeing the business versus executing and actually doing the business are two completely different things. Some businesses are reluctant to ship internationally because of confusing and complicated requirements. Complex customs procedures can hold up the flow of your business products. Those are the reasons that 1% of U.S. business export today, and of those, 60% only go to one country. Exporting obstacles are especially burdensome for small and mid-sized companies, and many of these companies do need help. There are many government entities, such as the U.S. Commercial Services, Small Business Administration, the Export-Import Bank, resources that new exporters can look to provide them additional support. Of course, there's the World Trade Center. UPS is also out there. We'd be happy to help you. Which, if you haven't heard our new tagline, United Problem Solvers, you'll be hearing a lot of that in the next few years. At UPS, we know that it's much easier to trade when more trade happens. More trade is good for our business, but even more specifically, more trade is good for our customers as well. According to the Small Business Administration, companies participating in international trade are 20% more productive and have 20% better job growth than those that don't. Next slide. So really in closing, something that former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, arguing against global trade is like arguing against the laws of gravity. An interconnected world is a reality. Powerful economies and booming middle classes outside of the U.S. are the norm. These are the forces that cannot be denied. The only issue now is how we manage them and if we engage or not. There's an old saying, a pessimist curses the wind, an optimist hopes it will change, and a realist adjusts the sails. We just all need to be realists and realize the power of global trade.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about the enabler of global commerce, and that's communications, and that's the role of language that language plays in global commerce. So, our yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Would you like to change?
I'm sorry.
Would you like to go next?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Okay. All right. Then forget about that. So we talked about the